If I had a nickel for every time a Bridgerton female lead punched her male love interest, I'd have 2 nickels. Hello, my name is Emma. I decided to read the whole Bridgerton book series in a little over 2 weeks, and I've decided to make it everyone else's problem. Basically, everyone that I've explained what I'm doing to has been promptly baffled, and as one friend very lovingly put it, Emma, how could you do this to yourself during Pride Month, no less? That's practically homophobic. Because when I started this endeavor, it was June. It's now almost August, and by the time this is edited and released, God knows when it will be. But we did start in June. I'm going to try and justify myself here, even though justifications have meant absolutely nothing to anyone so far on this journey, and I don't expect it to now, but if I don't try, I'll feel kind of pathetic. This has been a show that's been out for some years now. Well, it's actively releasing, but it started some years back. And I only started watching this summer, and that was only because I like the actress who plays Penelope Featherington. So I watched the first 7 episodes of season 1, stopped, got filled in on the events of season 3 by my sister, because I was like, oh, I'm just never gonna go back to that show. Just tell me what happens, I don't care. Part 2 of season 3 came out, and some of my friends were like, oh yeah, we're just streaming to watch it. And I was like, oh cool, I know what happens in the first part of season 3. This will be fine. So I jumped in, watched the last 3 episodes of season 3 with them, and if those 3 episodes had been different, we probably wouldn't be here today. After 3 seasons, Bridgerton did something that I well and truly never thought they would actually do, which was confirm main character queer Bridgertons. I will say I was as stunned as anyone. I really thought that they were gonna, cling to the book is Bible and we're just gonna throw in some side characters, maybe. No, they really went all in. They confirmed Benedict as bisexual, and they gender bent the love interest of Francesca from Michael to Michaela. So then my social media feed was flooded with people who were lamenting these changes and going on about how much better these books were, and an equal number of people who were lamenting the changes but were also lambasting the original books. And basically they were like, these are drivel, not worth reading, XYZ. There were a lot of homophobic tirades ranging from politely misinformed to absolutely vile. Not relevant at this current point, but you should just know. If there's one thing you all should know about me, it's that there's nothing I absolutely love more than having an opinion and doing a bunch of thorough and unnecessary research to develop an opinion. So I decided that the best thing to do would be to read the 8 books about the Bridgerton siblings. That all happened. So, what are we doing? What is our plan? I'm going to give an overview of all of the books on the series with my thoughts. I have no idea how long this is going to be. My initial notes on just the books themselves were 51 pages, and my final draft of notes for the video is somewhere in the realm of 85. This might get split up, or it might not. It's definitely going to take more than one filming session, so if my shirt changes, or the light changes, or things are different, please forgive me. I'm gonna just issue a disclaimer here that this is not going to be an attempt to discuss the claim that I've seen everywhere, that the books are quote-unquote hotter. As your friendly neighborhood lesbian, I'm both ill-equipped and entirely uninterested in the series from that perspective. So we're not gonna address it in that context. Thank you and have a nice evening. About the series itself. It's set in Regency-era Britain. It follows the romances of these 8 siblings of the deceased Viscount Bridgerton and his wife. This is where I would like to interject that I actually really like historical romance, historical fiction, and Regency specifically, because I feel like you can interject a lot of longing and tension into the stories, and that's something that I really like. It is not something we will see paid off. Basically, the premise of these books is that the Dowager Viscountess, Lady Violet Bridgerton, wants to see all 8 of her children settled down into love matches, because she and her husband had a true love match and she wants this for her children as well. The children are named alphabetically in order: Anthony, Benedict, Colin, Daphne, Eloise, Francesca, Gregory, and Hyacinth. However, the book order is different. It goes Daphne, Anthony, Benedict, Colin, Eloise, Francesca, Hyacinth, and then Gregory. Each book covers the great love of whichever Bridgerton sibling we're on this time. Now I'm going to talk about Lady Whistledown. And the first 4 books of the series they have the framing device of an anonymous gossip columnist known as Lady Whistledown. And if you've only watched the show, or like me started with the show, only to later read the books, you could be forgiven for laboring under the assumption that Lady Whistledown and who she is, and the impact of her writings on the characters, might be a central part of the series. And we would be wrong. For the first 4 books, all of the chapters open with an excerpt of Whistledown. It's typically relevant to the characters and the storyline that we're seeing, but in the first 3 books, she kind of has minimal, if any, actual impact. Book 4 is the Lady Whistledown book of the series, and so that's kind of where all the drama is contained. There's a lot of hand-wringing about the impacts of this secret being revealed and all of this stuff because Whistledown has insulted all of these people. Reading the books, I never saw any real anger directed towards Lady Whistledown or any kind of specific thing that she had done to ruin anyone's life. In contrast to the show where she reveals a secret pregnancy and Eloise's attendance at a political rally, like things that can and do have tremendous impacts on people's lives and reputations, Whistledown in the books kind of seems to be like, at its worst, the Regency version of Fashion Police. I don't know, I feel like I wanted either the reveal of Lady Whistledown's identity to not be the end of her writing, or for Whistledown and her story to have been the conclusion of the series, something that we build to, something that there's a lot of speculation about. To do that, I admit we would have to rework the timeline because it is Colin's book. I basically have 2 big bones to pick with the series, and the first is in Lady Whistledown and how absolutely unnecessary she is in every context. That is actually something I would love to hear from other people who've read the books about. What did you think of Lady Whistledown in the books? We're going to get into the obligatory disclaimers section. We already covered one of the disclaimers, but let's get into the rest of them. So I'm going to say a lot of things in this review, and if I know myself at all, I know that I'm going to work myself into a frenzied state over at least a couple things, and I want to make this clear that this is not an indictment of Julia Quinn, either as a person or as an author. As an author, I think she's perfectly serviceable, and as a person, I don't know her and cannot comment on her character. I will say that I think Ms. Quinn and I have somewhat differing tastes in the romance genre, and that we would probably disagree on what makes someone compelling romantically. However, fiction is fiction, and people are entitled to write whatever they like, even if some of us find it distasteful. And I'd also like to address fans of the books. Hello. I'm not trying to come at you and judge you for enjoying these books. I have pretty mixed feelings on them overall, but I want to make it clear that even if I despise a book, or a romantic lead, or some other aspect of the story, I don't want you to think that I think that you're a terrible person, or that you lack media literacy, or anything if you enjoy it. This is, in as much possible, all in good fun, and because I spiraled on a rabbit hole and people must know. This brings us to our first book, The Duke and I. As we've previously established, this is Daphne's book. Daphne is the eldest daughter, but the 4th eldest sibling overall, so she's exactly in the middle. So, the plot of this book. Daphne Bridgerton is in her 2nd year of society. She has received 4 marriage proposals, but none of them have been suitable for a variety of reasons, and most recently she's been pursued by a man named Nigel Burnbridge, who is not taking rejection at face value. Daphne is, for some reason, kind of a not like other girls kind of person. Apparently men like her, but they only see her as friend potential, which in the Regency era confuses me, but I will read you the passage. Men, she thought with disgust, were interested only in those women who terrified them. No one seemed inclined to court someone like her. They all adored her. Or, they said, because she was so easy to talk to, and she always seemed to understand how a man felt. As one of the men Daphne had thought might make a reasonably good husband had said, "Deuce take it, Daff. You're just not like regular females. You're positively normal." Which she might have considered a compliment if he hadn't proceeded to wander off in the search of the latest blonde beauty. We see it, right? So we've established our romantic heroine, kind of, to our romantic hero. Simon Bassett, the Duke of Hastings, is returning to England because of his father's death after 6 years abroad. Simon hated his father when he was a kid and as an adult because his father valued having an heir and the dukedom to the point that it killed his wife, and he was, like, very dismissive of Simon, who had a stutter as a child, and so his father was ashamed of him and claimed that he was dead. All reasonable reasons for hating one's father, if you ask me. So because of this, and this is very important, Simon vows that he will never marry or have children so that the family line will end with him and he does not do what his father wanted. And he is best friends with Anthony Bridgerton, the eldest Bridgerton and the current Viscount. So there's a ball that is being held by a woman named Lady Danbury, who I'm going to interject here is a wonderful character both in the show and in the book. She's slightly more relevant in the show, though basically everyone is. At Lady Danbury's ball, the Duke agrees to make an appearance because he is fond of Lady Danbury for her kindness to him when he was a child, but he wants to basically go in and out really quick because he doesn't want to be involved in London society or be scouted by matchmaking mothers. Daphne and the 3 eldest Bridgerton boys are in attendance. Daphne and Antony are trying to avoid their mother's matchmaking, and Daphne is especially trying to avoid Nigel, who is preparing to make yet another proposal. I don't think that Nigel's multiple proposals are counted in the 4 proposals she's received, but who knows? While trying to escape Nigel, Daphne ends up alone, cornered by him, and is trying to politely dismiss him. Simon overhears this, thinks he'll have to intervene and rescue her, and Nigel makes what I will term an impolite advance. The exact nature of it is unclear, but it's enough for Daphne to clock him and knock him out. Simon appears from the shadows and tries to help her with hiding or removing Nigel's passed out body, and he's really creepy and weird here. Simon felt a strange sort of admiration for this girl. Most women of his acquaintance would have been in hysterics at this point, but she, whoever she was, had taken the situation firmly in hand and was now displaying a generosity of spirit that was astounding. That she could even think to defend this Nigel person was quite beyond him. The Duke took a step forward, his stance positively menacing. "Miss Bridgerton, I feel I should warn you that I am within an inch of strangling the information out of you." His lips curved into a slow smile. "Let me make certain I have this correctly. Your mother told you that I am a very bad man, and that you are under no circumstances to be seen with me." Confused, she nodded. "Then what," he asked, pausing for dramatic effect, "do you think your mother would say about this little scenario?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Well, unless you count Nigel here." He waved his hand towards the unconscious man on the floor. "No one has actually seen you in my presence. And yet," he let his words trail off, having far too much fun watching the play of emotions on her face to do anything but drag this moment out to its lengthiest extreme. Of course, most of the emotions on her face were varying shades of irritation and dismay, but that made the moment all the sweeter. Not that he thought she would report this interlude to Antony. Somehow he knew that she would prefer to keep this to herself, stewing over it in privately righteous fury, and dare he hope it just a touch of excitement. Simon paused, rather irritated that this slip of a girl had shown such disrespect for his authority. There were advantages to being considered a dangerous man, and being able to cow young maidens was supposed to be one of them. And Daphne tells him that she's been warned away from engaging with him by her mother. Nigel wakes up, pushes Daphne against a wall. Simon knocks him out again, and then they abscond to the ballroom, leaving him there. Simon thinks that Daphne is too nice to Nigel, but also respects her for, quote, not panicking like other women. Daphne is paraded around to meet more eligible men. The Duke talks to the Bridgerton brothers, lies to them, that he and Daphne briefly met in passing in the hall, and then is reintroduced to her and Lady Bridgerton. So he sees the Featheringtons approaching and asks her to dance to avoid having to converse with the Featheringtons. On the dance floor, he proposes to pretend court her to avoid matchmaking for him and to entice suitors for her. And she immediately agrees. So the next morning, he comes to the Bridgerton home where 6 men are there to call on Daphne, and he internally rages about the fact that Daphne does not immediately notice him, and the fact that one of these men is reciting poetry to her. He fixed his gaze on Daphne, who was directing her magnificent smile at the buffoon reciting poetry, and waited for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. Simon looked down at his free hand and noticed that it was curled into a tight fist. He scanned the room slowly, trying to decide on which man's face to use it. Daphne smiled again, and again nodded him. The idiot poet. Definitely the idiot poet. Simon tilted his head slightly to the side as he analyzed the young swain's face. Would his fist fit best in the right eye socket or the left? Maybe that would be too violent. Maybe a light clip on the chin would be more appropriate. At the very least, it might actually shut the man up. "This one," the poet announced grandly, "I wrote in your honor last night." Simon groaned. The last poem he had recognized as a rather grandiose rendition of a Shakespearean sonnet, but an original work was more than he could bear. So, after Daphne finally notices that he's there, Simon charms the Lady Bridgerton with flowers, and Antony shows up and complains that Simon is courting Daphne. Lady Bridgerton is like, I don't care. He can court her. Antony and Simon have a private conversation in Antony's office where they both attempt to strangle one another. Daphne shows up to check in on them, and basically they tell Antony about this plan, which he vehemently opposes, but eventually agrees to with the stipulations that no one can know it's a charade, and if Simon makes any sort of move, Antony will kill him. So then Simon attends a Bridgerton family dinner and goes on an outing with them to Greenwich. Daphne notes that Simon is good with children, and Simon shuts the hell down. After this, Antony and Daphne have a late-night talk, during which they can't figure out how to warm milk on a stove, because they're privileged rich kids. Daphne basically asks Antony why Simon doesn't want to marry. Internally, she's already realized she's a little bit in love with him, which, isn't great when you take into account the fact that he's sworn never to marry. Granted, she doesn't know that, and Antony doesn't explain he may not actually know why Simon doesn't want to marry, but he believes that Simon is going to stick to it, and he's just not the guy for Daphne. At a ball that Simon is not meant to be attending in order to have Daphne meet other eligible men, Simon shows up, where he is approached by a friend of his father's who is like, "Oh, the Duke, the former Duke, left me this stack of letters to you. Can I give them to you?" And Simon says, "Burn them, please." And Daphne says, "Oh, please don't do that." And the friend goes, "Well, young lady, you should have the letters to give to him." They go out on the terrace together, and Daphne wants to kiss him so that he'll understand that she loves him. And so she invites him into the gardens. This can't happen because they're unchaperoned. And he protests but follows her, supposedly under the guise of stopping her. So then they end up making out in the gardens and are caught by Antony. Is anyone surprised? Antony and Simon get into a fight, as expected, and I only mention this because then they knock Daphne into a bush that I have to assume is thorned. So the lads stop fighting so Daphne can be pulled from the bush by Simon, and this shreds her gown. Like literal tatters. She is not wearing clothing anymore. She has to wear Antony's coat to avoid being indecent, and Antony punches Simon several times as Simon apologizes for being unable to marry Daphne and says that if he'd marry anyone, it would be her. She's understandably pretty damn upset, which is not helped when Antony challenges him to a duel, despite the fact that Daphne is protesting, and escorts Daphne home. So Daphne is convinced that Simon will let Antony kill him, and because she loves him, she convinces Colin, who came home to let her know that a friend of his saw her and the Duke disappear into the gardens, to help her prevent the duel by compelling Simon to marry her. Romantic. Basically, she rides in like a bat out of hell, pissing off both Antony and Simon. Simon wants to kill Colin for helping her, as one does. She compels Simon to agree to marrying her after punching him. The reason for this is technically to delay the duel, but I don't really understand how this delays the duel. And she explains that they were seen, and then exaggerates how many people have seen them. And so he agrees to marry her. Well, so he basically says he can't have children, and doesn't make it clear that he won't have children. Daphne agrees to marry him, even though her greatest desire is to be a mother, and tells him that he's worth it. I don't think he is, but she's not really a peach either. The Duke is weirdly chill about convincing Daphne to marry him under false pretenses. One might actually say he's happy about it. I also want to note that he, has 2 black eyes and a big bruise on his face. He resolves things with Anthony, gives Daphne a wedding ring, and then Violet gives this really vague talk about marital acts, and then they get married. So, I'm 90% sure this man is actively bruised as fuck at his wedding. And, I want a Whistledown article about this so bad that I wrote it. Dearest gentle reader, members of the Taunton can only be left to speculate on what was up to this point considered, both by this author and the Taunton at large, the love story of the season, when the Duke of Hastings, Simon Bassett, arrived at his own wedding, bruised beyond recognition. One might have to wonder whether something beyond Daphne Bridgerton's charms, perhaps the fists of her 3 elder brothers, compelled the Duke into marriage. So anyway, Simon decides they need to get to his estate out of London as soon as possible. We don't know why. I'm choosing to assume it's because he's been beaten to a goddamn pulp. So Daphne is under the impression that he either is incapable of or does not want to have their wedding night. And so they stop at an inn for a night, and he's like, but I can't have our wedding night here. So Daphne bursts into tears because this confirms to her that he is unable to because of his inability to have children, and he's offended at this assumption. So they spend their wedding night at the inn. Then they go to his estate, and then he still hasn't told her anything about his childhood, and so he gets really weird when she says something about it. And then she learns that his father thought he was stupid as a child because of his speaking delay, and I think she learns that from, a servant, of all people. And Simon has this weird moment where his wife is looking at his mouth and is like, she's looking at my weird mouth because it was weird when I was a child, and not my wife wants to kiss me. And so Daphne admits she loves him, and based off of the conversation that she has with the housekeeper, it occurs to Daphne that Simon actually can have children, he just won't. So Daphne admits she knows about his relationship with his father. Simon has this kind of villain monologue where he's like, the title dies with me, and then just leaves his wife alone. I don't care if he was wrong, Simon roared. All he cared about was the title. He never gave a single thought to me, about how I must feel, trapped with a mouth that didn't work. Daphne stumbled back a step, unsteady in the presence of such anger. This was fury of a decades-old resentment. Simon very suddenly stepped forward and pressed his face very close to hers. But do you know what? He asked in an awful voice. I shall have the last laugh. He thought there could be nothing worse than Hastings going to a half-wit. Simon, you're not... Are you even listening to me? He thundered. Daphne, frightened now, scurried back, her hand reaching for the doorknob in case she needed to escape. Of course I'm not an idiot, he spat out. In the end, I think he knew it too. And I'm sure it brought him great comfort. Hastings was safe. Never mind that I was not suffering as I once had. Hastings! That's what mattered. Daphne felt sick. She knew what was coming next. Simon suddenly smiled. It was a cruel, hard expression, one she had never seen on his face before. But Hastings dies with me, he said. All those cousins he was so worried about inheriting. He shrugged and let out a brittle laugh. The next morning, Daphne, tries to have a conversation about this. She's like, hey, so, you kind of misled me about, the whole having children thing. I was under the impression that you couldn't have children, and I loved you enough for that to not matter, but, because this is a weird vendetta, this is weird. And he's like, well, I said don't marry me. And then he goes on a whole thing about how it wasn't his fault that Daphne assumed that he couldn't have children rather than wouldn't. You told me you couldn't have children, she interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. There's a very big difference. Not, Simon said coldly, to me. I can't have children. My soul won't allow it. Simon kept to himself for most of the day. He didn't particularly want to see Daphne. That did nothing but make him feel guilty. Not, he assured himself, that he had anything to feel guilty about. He had told her before their marriage that he could not have children. He had given her every opportunity to back out, and she had chosen to marry him anyway. He had not forced her into anything. It was not his fault if she had misinterpreted his words and thought that he was physically unable to sire brats. So then Simon gets all pissed off because he hasn't seen Daphne all day, and he's like, I should be able to see my wife whenever I want, and goes to lecture her about that. He had not deceived her, not truly. He had told her that they wouldn't have children, and she had agreed to marry him anyway. He could see where she would feel a bit upset upon learning his reasons, but she could not say that she had entered this marriage with any foolish hopes or expectations. He stood. It was time they had another talk. This one at his behest. Daphne hadn't attended dinner, leaving him to dine alone, the silence of the night broken only by the metallic clink of his fork against his plate. He hadn't seen his wife since that morning. It was high time he did. She was his wife, he reminded himself. He ought to be able to see her whenever he damn well pleased. He marched down the hall and swung open the door to the Duke's bedroom, fully prepared to lecture her about something. The topic, he was sure, would come to him when necessary, but she wasn't there. Simon blinked, unable to believe his eyes. Where the hell was she? It was nearly midnight. She should be in bed. The dressing room. She had to be in the dressing room. The silly little chit insisted upon donning her night robe every night, even though Simon wriggled her out of it mere moments later. Daphne, he barked, crossing to the dressing room door. Daphne? No answer, and no light shining in the crack between the door and the floor. Surely she wouldn't dress in the dark. It turns out that she's in separate chambers, and then he screams at his servants on the matter because they aren't his parents and he isn't his father. And then he storms to her room, where the door is locked, and she says she doesn't want him in her bed, and asks him to go the fuck to sleep. So as one does, he threatens to break down the door, and Daphne is pretty convinced he'll do it, so she unlocks the door, and then he makes a manner of blustering threats and demands about her doing what he wants and yelling how he owns the room and Daphne herself. Romantic. Simon, argues that things between them aren't really about his father, and Daphne points out that, by refusing to have children because of his father, they very much are. So Simon reasserts that he legally owns her and that she couldn't stop him if he insisted on staying with her. Daphne says that he wouldn't do that to her, and small mercies he does not. He looked up, his eyes haunted. You're my wife. She said nothing. Legally, I own you. I can make you want me, he whispered. I know. His voice dropped even lower, hoarse and urgent. And even if I couldn't, you're mine. You belong to me. I could force you to let me stay. Daphne felt about 100 years old as she said, You would never do that. And he knew she was right. As a treat, I guess, for not assaulting his wife, Simon goes to the pub and beats 2 sailors bloody while imagining them as his father. So that's healthy and normal. So he gets hammered and is like, damn, I want my wife back. So he goes to his bedroom, or he goes to her bedroom, and whines pathetically at the door, and drunkenly he's babbling about wanting her back, and how Daphne doesn't understand why he can't just do what his father wanted, and he tells Daphne that his father would have approved of her, but he, married her anyway, so, doesn't that count for something? And this is when Daphne realizes that he's so drunk he won't be able to stop her from attempting to get pregnant. So Simon, in the next morning, when he's, sober, is pissed. And he leaves, and he's like, well, if you're pregnant, let me know. And she has this whole thing about how she believes she could fix him. And she desperately goes home and hopes that she's pregnant because, quote, it's her only chance. She's visited by Violet and Colin. She thinks she's pregnant. And Anthony shows up and promises to deliver Simon a letter without reading it and without, beating Simon dead. Yeah, so Anthony delivers it, and he leaves after giving a stern talk to Simon about how he should come back to his wife. Not because he loves Antony's sister, not because it's, a moral or upstanding thing to do, but because Lady Whistledown is writing about his absence and people are talking. Yeah, so Simon thinks about the thing that he hates most about this whole situation, and it's actually not that she she tried to conceive a child with him. It's that he was vulnerable and stuttered near her. He reads Daphne's letter, learns that she's pregnant, and is waiting for next steps in London. He goes to London. He briefly considers strangling both the Bridgerton butler and his own, finds Daphne is out riding, which she shouldn't do while pregnant, and so he saddles a horse to chase after her. Daphne heard someone following her and is afraid that she's going to be murdered, which fair. She tries looking for the groom who she took with her, and rides directly into a tree branch. Simon panics, checks her for injuries, and when she's okay, he starts yelling, "What the fuck are you thinking while riding while pregnant?" Which, fair, I guess. And she's like, "Well, what the fuck do you care? You didn't want a kid." And he's like, "Yeah, but now that it's here, I didn't want you to lose it by reckless behavior." So then she starts sobbing, and he's like, "Were you lying about being pregnant?" And she's like, "No, I thought I was, but I'm not." And says he left because he stuttered, not because of what she did, even though he should have left because of what she did, but okay. She says if he wants children but won't because of his dad, that's dumb, and he says that he wants to be happy, and she says he will be. So then they get home, all three of the elder Bridgerton brothers are there and are like, "We're not leaving till we're sure he loves you." And in Regency England, there's no way to back out of this marriage, so sweet thought, but what the fuck are we doing here? Simon and Daphne step down the hall to discuss this development, and he's like, "I love you," kisses her, and then he realizes the brothers are still there and growls at them to get out. They start to leave when Violet shows up. She's pissed at her sons and drags them all out by the ears. And Simon decides he's willing to have a child, but is nervous because he never planned to and is afraid that the child might inherit his speech delay. Daphne comforts him. Then Daphne remembers those letters from half the book ago from the friend of the former Duke, and I guess she got them at some point. So she shows them to him, and he's like, whatever, and doesn't read them. So then we time skip to them having 3 daughters and a recently born son, where the Duke hates Whistledown once they're discovered, but Daphne's like, "I really like that we're considered the most besotted couple in London." Then the second epilogue takes place over 2 decades into their marriage, when Daphne discovers she's pregnant 16 years after their last child. Of the scenes with Simon, this is probably one of the better ones. He's also mostly not there. But then they, read the freaking letters, and they don't matter at all. So this is the only one that I had the benefit of seeing as its show adaptation before reading it. And even though I didn't love the show version, I could see why people did like it, thought it was fine, but I just wasn't super invested. Ignoring the show entirely, honestly, probably if I had read this without the goal in mind to read all 8 of the books, I probably would have abandoned the series right there. Simon is kind of a petulant child who's constantly threatening his wife even before he's married to her. He likes to threaten, be imposing and scary. His inner monologue is filled with these fantasies of violence, and he somewhat deliberately, somewhat accidentally misleads his wife on the whole ability to have children thing. Daphne, if I'm honest, is probably the Bridgerton that I know least, and that may end up being a tough competition in the end, but even in subsequent books, Daphne's appearances are minor and don't really amount much in terms of character. What we know about her in book 1 is that she's 3 years into her time on the marriage mart, and she has received no adequate proposals. She's generally perceived as one of the guy's friend material to eligible men that she meets, and I don't really have much to say about her other than the whole baby trapping thing. So this really gets glossed over in the narrative, and while it happens in the show too, I don't think I anticipated how deliberate and sinister it was going to come off in the book. I didn't go super in-depth in my plot recap of what this consisted of. In the show, Daphne is kind of trying to confirm this theory that her husband lied to her, which isn't good still, but in the book, she's already aware that he's lying and goes into this encounter with the perspective of, 1, this may be her only opportunity to conceive a child, and 2, Simon is too drunk to stop her. Those are her literal thoughts on the matter. And I think this really gets written off because Daphne's a woman, and as much as I'm not super on board with Simon and his whole deal, I really don't like this, and it makes Daphne fairly unlikable. And I think in the end she's probably the female love interest in the entire series I like the least. And actually, she's probably the only one I actively dislike. The pacing works for the story here, and how much of Simon's hatred of his father is controlling his life to his detriment, that makes sense. there ends up being like a theme in these books about people like getting married and then spending an inordinate amount of their time after they're married wondering if they're in love with their spouse, and roughly half of that time horrified or confused to realize that they're in love with the person they married, which is like tedious, especially if you're like me and like the tension and pining, but you don't get that because they're literally already in a committed romantic marriage and they're having these weird tormented feelings during it. It's also just weird to me how much we skip over this fake courtship. In the show, you see it a lot more. You, like, get scenes of them interacting during this courtship, and it provides the groundwork for you to be invested in their relationship. But here we only see them a couple times, skip time, and then the ruse is working, but Daphne, like, never speaks to another man with, like, genuine interest. I don't like either of the main characters, but maybe they deserve each other. What the fuck do I know? Antony's book, who is the Viscount and the eldest Bridgerton. Antony's whole thing is about how his father, Edmund, was 38 when he died, and Antony was about 18, and his father died of a bee sting. And so Edmund was, like, Antony's hero, and he can't imagine surpassing his father in any way, including living longer than him. So, about 10 years later, when Antony's, like, 28, he is beginning to anticipate his death and knows that he must marry and have a son to pass on his title. Antony has 3 requirements for a wife. First, she must be reasonably attractive. Second, she cannot be stupid, not for his sake, but because he wants intelligent children. And third, she cannot be someone that he has the potential to fall in love with. Antony is basically like, okay, well, whichever woman of the ton is declared the incomparable, which is the most desirable woman of the season, I'll just marry her. The incomparable is a woman named Edwina Sheffield, who, spoiler alert, is not the love interest of this book. Edwina and her older half-sister Kate have come to London for their first season. Kate, at the age of 20 or 21, is considered long in the tooth and considers herself practically a spinster. So, because of the family's limited finances, Kate's debut was delayed because they couldn't come to London for 2 separate seasons, so now that Edwina is of age, they can both go. So at a ball, Edwina basically is like, since my dad is dead, I'm seeking my sister's approval to get married. And Antony learns that Edwina was coherent enough about mythology in a conversation and basically decides that's good enough for him and is like, I shall marry her. And to be clear, like, that is not a conversation that he had with her. He just hears from someone else, probably one of his brothers, that she was able to have this conversation. They haven't actually met at this point. So Kate, who really enjoys and respects Lady Whistledown, is aware of Anthony Bridgerton and his reputation as a rake. So at the ball, she meets Colin Bridgerton and speaks to him frankly about why she doesn't want her sister marrying Antony. Antony and Edwina dance, and Antony is like, okay, I had already decided, but this seems like it will be fine. Colin introduces Antony to Kate, and he has led Antony to believe that she will be a shrinking spinster wallflower, which to his dismay is untrue. And then Colin forces Antony to take his place in a dance with Kate to both of their displeasure. So they verbally spar a little bit. Kate finds that being compared to her sister is the most offending thing because it can't be true. Antony is basically like, I will court your sister, and I will marry her, if I want to, because you've offered me a challenge. So she stomps on his foot. The next day, Antony comes to the Sheffield house to court Edwina, and Kate, unfortunately for him, is the only one at the house, and she's talking to the flowers, which I thought was cute. He's brought flowers both for Kate and for their mother, as well as Edwina, which, despite herself, Kate is moved by because she's never received flowers. And then Antony confesses that he stole that move from the Duke in the last book. So Kate realizes they're unchaperoned, and Antony is absolutely horrified that he might be forced to marry Kate. And then Kate's stepmom comes in, chased by Kate's Corgi Newton, and she insists that Kate and Antony take the dog for a walk. Antony accepts the offer in the hope of running into Edwina, who's currently being taken on a carriage ride by Nigel Burbrook. We remember Nigel, don't we? He's a prince. So while on the walk, the Corgi escapes and goes on a tear through the park, succeeding in knocking Edwina, Nigel, and Antony into the lake. Antony is annoyed and takes Edwina home, leaving Kate to be taken back by Nigel. He also blames her. He's like, you made this happen. You're jealous of your sister. You made your dog run rampant through a park and knock her into the river. And Kate's like, I don't even know how I would do that. Whistledown writes about the event, calling Newton an unnamed dog of indeterminate breed, which Kate is somewhat offended by, leading to a wonderful Whistledown introduction to the next chapter. It has come to this author's attention that Miss Catherine Sheffield took offense at the labeling of her beloved pet an unnamed dog of indeterminate breed. This author is, to be sure, prostrate with shame at this grievous and egregious error, and begs of you, dear reader, to accept this abject apology and pay attention to the first ever correction in the history of this column. Miss Catherine Sheffield's dog is a corgi. It is called Newton, although it is difficult to imagine that England's greatest inventor and physicists would have appreciated being immortalized in the form of a short, fat canine with poor manners. Edwina's fall in the river makes her end up getting sick, and despite the fact that Kate is really only thinking she's here to, get her sister a husband, she ends up compelled to go to a Bridgerton-hosted music event where they're having an opera singer. She, sulks off, goes off during the event or after the event, and anyway, here's Antony coming to seduce said opera singer, and she kind of ducks into the nearest room, which just so happens to be his office. Unfortunately for her, that's where he and the opera singer are going, and she's found there, but not before she overhears his intention to not love his wife and instead just keep a mistress. Which is really what you want to hear when you're thinking of, letting a man marry your sister. He's understandably pissed off that she's spying on him, and he's like, you're doing this because you like me. And she doesn't really deny it or say much of anything, so his automatic response is to kiss her, as one does. And she's like, yeah, you're not gonna marry my sister, or me, just to be clear, and you have no honor. So he gets really pissed off, grabs her by the face, and says, if you were a man, I'd call you out on this. She then, basically breaks down and begs him to let her leave, and this ends up, having a whole conversation where he's like, I still intend to court your sister. And Antony, finally, at this point, realizes that Kate actually loves and cares for her sister, like he cares for his sisters. So glad we could establish that. So then, of course, Lady Bridgerton invites Kate and her family to the country house for a party. Yeah, it's basically just a gathering at the country house with a bunch of men less eligible than her sons, and a gaggle of unmarried women, and she's really just hoping that one of them will be struck by Cupid's arrow and fall in love. When they get there, Kate is like, oh, these are really beautiful gardens, and she's like, I'm gonna go walk the gardens, and Lady Bridgerton goes, Antony, you should go walk the gardens. So of course they run into each other. Antony picks a flower and gives it to Kate because, and I quote, Edwina shouldn't get all of the flowers, and then apologizes for what he said to her in his office. But Kate thinks that he's apologizing for kissing her, which he's not, which, maybe he should. So then Cullen appears, as if from nowhere, to announce that Daphne and Simon have arrived, and they're there to play a game called Pall Mall. The closest thing I can compare this to is croquet, and I'm not entirely sure that it isn't croquet, but it doesn't matter. Just think croquet adjacent. Colin gets his brother involved, he invites Kate, and Antony's like, oh, and I'll bring Edwina too. So he leaves to go get Edwina, who's at the house. Kate and Colin go to set up the course with Daphne and Simon. And Antony is taking a really long time getting back with Edwina, which is making Kate very anxious. She's like, is he defiling her, XYZ? But anyway, they arrange for Antony to play with the pink mallet, and Kate plays with the black mallet, which he nicknamed the Mallet of Death. Antony and Edwina arrive late, though nothing untoward happened. Antony sabotages Kate's game, and then when Kate receives the opportunity, she sends his ball into the nearby lake, and the other Bridgertons basically go, well, that means you win, so. And Edwina's like, hey, maybe we should get that ball out of the lake. And Antony really just complains about it a whole deal, but he does it, and Kate comes down, and while they're verbally sparring, she did bring him a blanket, because it's cold and he's wet. So they walk back together, and Antony realizes that he has affection for Kate, so he asks her to honestly answer the question of if she still hates him, and she says nothing. So in a move even weirder than kissing her the first time, he kisses the inside of her wrist, and then just leaves. Kate is confused, which is fair, because I'm also confused. Then they go to dinner, like everybody at this party is going to dinner, and while it's not particularly plot relevant, there's this whole interlude about how Kate had been insulted by Lady Whistledown, being called like a singed daffodil. She and Penelope Featherington have like this kinship in the fact that they've both been insulted for their fashion choices by Lady Whistledown. Kate and Penelope are like hanging out, like I guess they don't really know each other, but they have this kinship through the fact they've both been insulted by Lady Whistledown. So they go down to dinner, where Penelope is harassed by Cressida Cowper, who matters more in the show, but whatever. Antony, seeing this, kind of swoops in, escorts Penelope to dinner, and Katie's like, oh my god, what a chivalrous gentleman, what a hero. And then we're done. So Kate can't sleep, and so she decides that she's just gonna wander the Bridgertons' country home, as one does. I think she's going to find the library, and she does find the library, though I can't remember if it's on purpose or accident, but let's give her the benefit of the doubt. She was going to the library and not just, like, wandering the home of these people at night. Yeah, so she goes to the library, and a thunderstorm starts. And this becomes important. Kate is terrified of thunderstorms. Like, absolutely petrified of them. Antony happens to be walking to his room, and he's, like, basically just lamenting the fact that he actually kind of likes Kate. And so he goes into the library thinking he left a candle burning, and finds Kate cowering under a table during this thunderstorm. Yeah, so he is quite chivalrous. He climbs down, he crawls under the table with her, and, you know, comforts her and tells her about the house to try and calm her down. So, then they have a conversation about their respective dead parents. The very next day, Kate goes out to the garden, and she's, like, thinking, and she's like, I really have no justifiable reason to not let my sister marry Antony. I personally think that, like, maybe the fact that he said that he doesn't want to, like, love his wife, and depending on what your sister is looking, like, she should at least know, right? Like, but whatever. Fine. Sure, she's like, I have no reason for her not to marry him, except for the fact that I like him, and, you know, he would just never return those feelings for me, so I guess he'll marry my sister. So he goes out to the garden to see her, and she's like, hey, I've been thinking about it. I don't have a reason to object to you marrying my sister. Like, you have my blessing if you want it. And he kind of just deflates. And, like, it's basically revealed that he's afraid of love because of how much his father's death impacted his mother. And so he's like, well, I don't want to ruin people's lives like that. She was giving him what he wanted. Exactly, he reminded himself, what he wanted. With her sister's blessing, Edwina would marry him next week if he so desired. Then why the devil did he want to grab her by the shoulders and shake and shake and shake until she took back every bloody little annoying word? It was that spark, that damnable spark that never seemed to dim between them. That awful prickle of awareness that burned every time she entered a room, or took a breath, or pointed a toe. That sinking feeling that if he could, if he let himself, love her. Which was the one thing he feared most, perhaps the only thing he feared at all. It was ironic, but death was the one thing he wasn't afraid of. Death wasn't frightening to a man alone. The great beyond held no terror when one had managed to avoid attachments here on earth. Love was truly spectacular. sacred thing. Antony knew that. He'd seen it every day of his childhood, every time his parents had shared a glance or touched hands. But love was the enemy of a dying man. It was the only thing that could make the rest of his years intolerable. To taste bliss and know it would all be snatched away. And that was probably why, when Antony finally reacted to her words, he didn't yank her to him and kiss her until she was gasping, and he didn't press his lips to her ear and burn his breath against her skin, making sure she understood that he was on fire for her and not her sister. Never her sister. And this is when a bee flies into the scene. So Antony freaks the fuck out, because, his dad died via bee sting, and Kate is like, dude, it's just a bee. Chill, chill, chill. And Antony kind of holds her in place. She tries to leave and inadvertently bounces the bee onto her chest where it stings her. So he starts touching her chest, and Kate is understandably like, dude, what the fuck? And Antony is like, I have to get the venom out. So he's trying to squeeze out the venom. Which I think Kate and I are both like, there's venom? I don't know if squeezing's really gonna fix this issue. Kate is like, I've been stung before, it'll be fine. And Antony is like, so was my dad, but he died. So he decides that he's just gonna suck the venom out of her chest. So to the great confusion of Kate, this occurs, and she looks up to see the following party of people. Her stepmother, Lady Bridgerton, and Mrs. Featherington. So then Featherington goes, well, you have to get married. You have to get... He had his mouth on your chest. You must be married. And Antony pushes back on this for all of 2 seconds and then goes, well, look, I wasn't gonna marry her because, I could love her and, that would really suck, because, who wants to love their wife? But if the universe ordains it, I will marry her. Even if that means you're at the whim of a bee, apparently. So then Antony kind of sends everyone away and is like, a moment with my future wife, please. Which shouldn't really happen because, chaperones and whatever, but, I guess they're already engaged, so, okay. Antony is like, well, I may as well just kiss her. So he kisses her, and he's like, fine, I care about her, and I'm attracted to her, but I cannot love her. That is the line. That is the line. And Kate, on the other hand, is like, well, I have to convince him to leave me. Because he's in love with my sister, and when he's kissing me, he's thinking of my sister. And that's where we leave the country party. So they go back to London. Whistledown's writing a lot of things, and she's being dragged around to a lot of shops by Lady Bridgerton. And Antony comes over to be like, hey, I just wanted to clear the air on this one tiny little thing. I know you overheard that thing about me not loving my wife, and I cannot, I do not, and I will not ever love you. So just good. We're good, right? So then they hook up. Where are the chaperones? I don't know. So then the stepmom shows up to give the talk before the wedding. She's like, hey, look, men can kind of just be happy with, any woman. It doesn't really matter. The woman doesn't really matter. But, you can kind of only be happy with your husband. So, take that as you will. And Kate's like, God, that really sucks, because, I was hoping that he might kind of like me, but, no, it just had to be any human female, apparently. She's bummed out. At the wedding, Gregory, tips over, or tries to tip over, Hyacinth's flower basket, and so she punches him, which doesn't matter at all. It's just, those are the moments I care about most in the series, actually. After the wedding, Kate is like, hey, could we maybe, hold off on this whole, wedding night thing for, about a week? Antony has a temper tantrum. Kate is alarmed because she realizes, to her horror, that she's falling in love with her husband. Yeah, so, when they're having their wedding night, he's calling her beautiful, and she kind of shuts down and wants to know, who he's picturing, because it's not her. She's like, I'm not beautiful, what? And obviously my mother said that a man can just be with any woman, so like he's obviously thinking about someone who's actually beautiful. Who is she? And, you know, Antony's like, oh no, it's you, and just kind of sets her straight on that matter. And so, of course, because what else would happen, there is a thunderstorm. And so Kate has a nightmare, and she's calling out for her birth mother. So Antony tries to comfort her, and in the morning he's like, hey, have you maybe ever spoken to your stepmom about, like, why you seem really, really traumatized by thunderstorms? And she's like, no, I actually haven't. Super smart thinking husband, I'm gonna go do that. So they go, and the stepmom reveals that when her bio mom was sick, it was thundering and raining for days, and Kate witnessed her mother's death in conjunction with a clap of thunder. So Kate is basically like, my trauma is solved. And she's like, the next storm, I'm gonna be so much better. It's gonna be great. And she's like, look, Antony, I think some subconscious part of me always thought that I would just, like, die when there was, like, a thunderstorm. I think I always just kind of expected that I would die. And Antony, who's been, like, expecting his death for ages, is like, oh, that's relatable, but he doesn't say anything about it. He doesn't go, oh, my darling wife. Well, I guess he wouldn't call her his darling wife because he's convinced he doesn't love her, but he's not like, oh, my wife, yeah, I get that. I also have unresolved trauma from the death of a parent. No. So he just kind of leaves, rushes out of the house, and Kate is like, I'm gonna pray for a storm, because, you know, if a storm happens while my husband is running amok, then I can prove to myself that I'm perfectly okay, and I'm fixed. I also just want to note that, like, all of the Whistledown headings over these chapters have been, like, Lady Whistledown going, like, Antony and Kate are in love in their marriage and I will not hear a word otherwise, which is funny. So anyway, Antony eventually comes home to his mother's house. He goes to the club, and while he's hungover, his brothers heckle him, and then he decides to go find his wife. Oh yes, he's also realized, like, he's in love with his wife at this point. Like, he's like, I love my wife, and he's horrified by this realization. So he goes to the club while hungover, his brothers heckle him, and he's like, I'm gonna go find my wife. And she's not at the house. She's at the park with Edwina and her new suitor, Mr. Bagwell the archaeologist, who has no real relevance other than the fact that he's here, and that Kate is acting as a chaperone for this expedition. Antony is, like, running through the park. He runs into Lady Danbury, who's like, you know, I really like your wife. And, you know, in fact, I think that I could just match the whole marriage mart and just, like, fix everything. And so then, right after this, Antony's chilling, and then he sees the carriage with Edwina and then Kate crash in it. So he freaks the heck out, yells that he's the one who's supposed to die, not her, pulls her from the carriage, and her leg is broken. And then he confesses his love to her. So then they go home, and they have this conversation about how he expects he's going to die, and she's like, honey, I love you, and you're wrong. I understand you're not going to believe that. Like, either of them can die like their parents, and they have to live without regret. So, like, she's like, you don't believe me, but, like, it'll be okay. The epilogue took place on Antony's 39th birthday, and to my great amusement features Whistledown's recounting of a god-awful concert the two of them performed. It wasn't relevant at any point prior to this in my summary, but Kate has been teaching herself the flute throughout the book and is just abysmal at it. So I really like that, like, some 20 years later, she is still abysmal at the flute. Lord Bridgerton celebrated his birthday. This author believes that it was his 39th, at home with his family. This author was not invited. Nonetheless, details of the fete have reached this author's always attentive ears, and it sounds to have been a most amusing party. The day began with a short concert. Lord Bridgerton on the trumpet, and Lady Bridgerton on the flute. Mrs. Bagwell, Lady Bridgerton's sister, apparently offered to mediate on the pianoforte, but her offer was refused. According to the Dowager Viscountess, a more discordant concert has never been performed, and we are told that eventually young Miles Bridgerton stood atop his chair and begged his parents to cease. We are also told that no one scolded the boy for his rudeness, but rather just heaved huge sighs of relief when Lord and Lady Bridgerton laid down their instruments. I don't know if this is going to be a disappointment or an excitement to the viewers of this video, but this was my favorite of the books. And it actually probably was to the detriment of the series that this was the second one that I read. Because I think it gave me unrealistic expectations in terms of the romantic leads of the series. It kind of given me a sense that I should be really wary of the Bridgerton leading men. And so, like, I was wary of Simon, and that was fair. But I was also wary of Anthony, and then I was like, okay, he has a couple, like, not ideal flaws, but, you know, he's actually better than I expected. So I think that I then put my bar at, like, oh, the worst we get is Simon, and the best we get is Anthony, and, like, there's kind of a narrow range there. When no, the best we get is Anthony, the middling is Simon, and there's actually a whole lot worse. Anthony has some, like, he has some violent outbursts, which, you know, I don't love, but they're a lot more sporadic than Simon's violent outbursts. And so, like, I felt like there were enough scenes where I got to see Anthony and Kate, like, interacting and developing a dynamic that I was like, oh, that's a nice dynamic. I like that dynamic. Anthony is probably the character for whom the whole we're already married and I'm freaking out because I'm in love conflict actually really works for, just because of his internal conflict and stuff. And, you know, that works. I still don't love it, but it works. Kate is my favorite character in the whole series. She has, like, the strongest voice of any of, like, the actual central characters. Any of the, like, romantic leads. Like, let's say there's, like, 16 central characters, because there's 2 romantic leads per book. She has, like, the strongest voice and is, like, the most compelling of them. It's not that the women in these books are overall, like, these wilting wallflowers, but I find Kate really charming. She just, like, really loves her dog, and she desires to learn the flute, and let herself be terrible at it, and she's headstrong and stubborn, and she, like, goes toe-to-toe with Anthony, and doesn't back down, which makes her a really compelling character. Kate's thunder thing is fine, especially as a parallel to Anthony's whole, like, I'm gonna die thing, but it's still weird, but, like, it's not my favorite part, but, like, I understand what it does to function within the story. I wish they weren't forced into marriage, even if being forced into marriage by a bee was the most amusing way that 2 people end up getting together in these books. I don't love forced marriage tropes, even if it is entrapped to marriage by a bee sting. If I'm probably looking at it pretty objectively, Anthony probably isn't that much better than any of the other leading men that I don't like. But, I like Kate a lot, and I'm not mad that she's marrying him. So, like, I think that we can see that as a good gauge, right? This is Benedict's book. We're gonna start where the book does, with his love interest, Sophie. She is the bastard daughter of an earl, but she's never officially, like, known as the bastard daughter of the earl. She's just kind of known as the ward of the earl. And he marries when she's 10, and the stepmother hates her and forbids her daughters from speaking to her. So anyway, he suddenly dies and has this provision in his will that the stepmother gets, like, £2,000 a year unless she continues caring for Sophie, in which case she gets £6,000 a year, which is, like, good planning, because, like, the stepmother fucking sucks, but, like, we maybe could have done better here. This is Cinderella, okay? Yeah, I kind of thought when they were saying, like, oh, it's a Cinderella story, I thought maybe, like, it was gonna be a little less direct in its parallel. But okay. So she is the housemaid and lady's maid of her stepmother and stepsisters, and they go to fancy balls and try and seduce Bridgerton boys. Clearly they're not very good at those things. And there's like this costume party this evening, and that's kind of the whole crux of the thing. And I bring it up for multiple reasons, but just to mention, like, one of my favorite things about this costume party is that the elder, meaner stepsister, Rosamond, is going as Marie Antoinette. And Sophie is like, oh, so does that mean that you're going to have, like, a string of red around your neck where she was beheaded? And Rosamond is not, but she should. Like, I feel quite strongly that she should, and I just think if you're going to be Marie Antoinette, you have to commit to showing off the beheading in some fashion. So anyway, our housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbons, is our fairy godmother, and she and the servants prepare Sophie to go to the ball. We even throw in a midnight deadline, and Benedict is chilling at this ball. He's in a mask, and he is like, oh, well, just kind of hanging out. And then people are like, oh, which Bridgerton brother are you? Like, I know, it's number 3. No, it's number 2. Anyway, this kind of becomes the crux of his whole thing, is that he's like, I don't have an identity out of being, like, Bridgerton number 2. I need an identity. So Benedict talks to his mother and agrees to go dance with Penelope Featherington. And Sophie enters, and Benedict turns around to look at her and abandons Penelope completely. So Benedict goes to speak to Sophie, and he's like, hey, how's it going? Would you like to dance? Sophie is like, I don't know how to dance. And Benedict's like, oh, cool. Yeah, let's go to the private terrace. I will teach you to dance. So Colin had to basically go dance with Penelope instead of Benedict because Benedict, bailed to go talk to this mysterious lady in silver who we know is Sophie, but he only knows is, like, this strange woman. Colin then, like, follows him to be like, hey, dude, like, you screwed over Penelope, which meant you screwed over me, dude. And he's like, you left me to the pack of wolves that are women seeking husbands by myself. How could you do this? I also just want to interject here, like, this is one of the first times that we really see Eloise in the series so far, but she attends this ball dressed as Joan of Arc, which I love. Penelope, unfortunately, is a leprechaun. So anyway, back out on the balcony, I assume Colin is gone at this point. Benedict and Sophie kiss. Benedict then licks her arm, and I have to assume that it's much more sensual than I'm making it seem, but he basically kisses her and then licks her arm. So he's like, okay, well, tell me who you are. Like, I want to come see you tomorrow, I want to court you, he all but proposes marriage, basically. So right on cue, clock strikes midnight, and it's the unmasking. And she bolts. Like, literally takes off running, runs into her stepmother, who does not recognize her. And rather than a shoe left behind, which is good because she actually stole the shoes from her stepmother, she leaves a glove. And it's the glove of her paternal grandmother, and it's got their initials and crest, but none of that belongs to her because she is a ward who is a maid. Benedict, like, the next morning goes to his mother and is like, hey, what is this glove? And the mother's like, oh, well, this glove belongs to this family. And, she's like, yeah, there's a stepmom and 2 sisters who live at the house, and he's like, oh, it must be one of these sisters. So he goes to the house. Before that happens, the stepmother notices a scuff on her new shoes that were borrowed and orders Sophie to shine all of the shoes, not just those shoes, like every shoe that she owns, and then, has her stepsister lock her in the closet. Physically lock her in a closet. Benedict shows up for the courting. He's like, wow, neither of these women are the silver lady that I met at the ball last night, and he flees very quickly, and he's just looking longingly at this glove in the street, and the stepmom looks out the window and goes, it was her, it must have been Sophie. Stepmom goes upstairs to where she's locked Sophie in the closet to shine the shoes. And she's kept Sophie a year past when the contract with the father's will stipulated she had to. And so she's like, she kicks her out. And she's like, but it is kind of a shame because I really did enjoy just like bossing you around. So Sophie talks back and the stepmom slaps her and tells her to leave, but not before she locks her back in the closet to finish polishing the shoes. So then she steals some jeweled shoe clips because she has no other money, and we skip 2 years into the future. Benedict is now 30 and he is at a party he has absolutely no interest in, so he's like, I'm gonna go try and find the host so I can say goodbye politely and leave. Sophie, who is the maid at this house, is like, I really need a new job. And also, we get a clarification that the shoe clips that she stole were not diamond like the stepmother claimed. She wants to leave this job because the host of the party, he keeps, harassing her and trying to assault her, and now that his parents, whose house this is, are out of town, she's, like, pretty actively unsafe, so she's like, yeah, I'm gonna quit, and she just starts walking to town. It's also the middle of the night. Keep this in mind. The host is a bloke named Philip Cavender, and he chases her down, grabs her by the back of the collar, and then 2 additional men appear from the shadows. Benedict happens upon this host and the men with Sophie and grumbles about having to save her because he doesn't like being the hero type, but he has too many sisters to leave a female in distress. And Benedict turned his head to the right. Cavender was standing under a stately old elm with 2 other gentlemen. They appeared to be having a bit of fun with the housemaid, pushing her back and forth between them. Benedict groaned. He was too far away to determine whether the housemaid was enjoying their attentions, and if she was not, then he was going to have to save her, which was not how he'd planned on to spend his evening. He'd never been particularly enamored of playing the hero, but he had far too many younger sisters, 4 to be precise, to ignore any female in distress. So Benedict basically goes, hey, knock this shit off, or I'll fight you. And the guys are like, we'll do what we want, bro. And Benedict is like, and if she doesn't want to? The host guy is like, I will fire her. And Benedict makes them formally ask Sophie if she'd like to be assaulted by these 3 gentlemen. And she's like, no. And Benedict is like, okay, go ahead, fire her. And the host boy is like, well, she's never going to work in this county again. And Benedict is like, I'll hire her for my mother's house then. Turns to her and goes, does that work for you? I mean, you will not be raped. And Sophie, much like me, kind of just stares in bafflement. She doesn't want to work for the Bridgertons because she knows who Benedict is, even if Benedict doesn't know who she is. And she's like, yeah, I don't want to be his servant. That would be humiliating, even if he doesn't know who I am. But she, doesn't want to be assaulted by this flock of men. So she's like, sure, cool, great, let's get out of here. So Benedict drives away, and then rain just kind of appears from nowhere, and Benedict, who is sick, begins coughing like mad. Didn't know Benedict was sick prior to this, but okay. So Sophie ends up driving the carriage, and when they get to the cottage, she takes over caring for the horses because he is so sick. He notices that she's upset, and she begins sobbing because of the whole situation. And once inside, he manages to light a fire before becoming very feverish and sick. She wakes up to him talking in his sleep. I think she's in a different room, so I don't know why she wakes up to this, but okay. And he's, like, asking to be kissed, and she refuses several times, but then kisses him once, tells him she loves him, and then she's like, yeah, but, like, he's feverish, so he, like, won't remember. It's fine. She tries to take care of him, but that's not really her area. And then she snoops through his stuff and finds a sketchbook that has a drawing of her from the masquerade ball. And an interjection from Lady Whistledown. It seems one cannot take 2 steps at a London ball these days without stumbling across a society matron lamenting the difficulties of finding good help. Indeed, this author thought that Mrs. Featherington and Lady Penwood were going to come to blows at last week's Smythe Smith musical. It seems that Lady Penwood stole Mrs. Featherington's lady's maid right out from under her nose 1 month ago, promising higher wages and free cast-off clothing. It should be noted that Mrs. Featherington also gave the poor girl cast-off clothing, but anyone who has ever observed the attire of the Featherington girls would understand why the lady's maid would not view this as a benefit. The plot thickened, however, when the lady's maid in question fled back to Mrs. Featherington, begging to be rehired. It seemed that Lady Penwood's idea of a lady's maid included duties more accurately ascribed to the scullery maid, upstairs maid, and cook. Someone ought to tell the woman that one girl cannot do the work of 3. Lady Penwood is the stepmother, so, like, all of Whistledown, really, this year is, like, about this kind of maid war, which I really enjoy, and is probably my favorite part of the book. She wakes up still sitting at his bedside, and there are the caretakers of this cottage, and she's trying to explain the situation and help serve everyone, while still wearing Benedict's overlarge clothes. I forgot that she was wearing Benedict's clothes, but, you know. And he, sick in bed, reiterates that he will find her a job with his mother, and she's like, oh, I'd really rather stay in the country, thank you. And he's like, oh, cool, like, I can have you work at my brother's country estate. And she's like, please don't think you have to be responsible for me just because you saved me, because she doesn't want to work for him or near him, but can't really say that without revealing her identity. So he considers the matter settled, and is like, great, you'll work for someone in my family. And he basically tells her not to throw a spoon at him, and so she doesn't, and then he laughs about it, so she throws a candle stub at him instead. Benedict is bedridden for days and realizes he actually really enjoys talking to Sophie. And then one day, like, she brings him tea, and he's like, wow, her clothes are really ugly. But she would never accept new clothes from him, unless perhaps her old ones burn. So, like, he's idly plotting how to burn her clothes so he can buy her new, which is very Pretty Woman. Actually, now that I think about it, Pretty Woman is not the worst comparison to this book. Like, it's not directly one-to-one, but, like, it's kind of the vibe. She's reading him poetry, and she's like, yeah, you're not listening to me, and so he's thinking about kissing her, and he's like, please leave, I need to attend to private business. And she's like, okay, well, ring for me if you need me. And he gets very upset at this idea of treating her as a servant, and she's like, okay, but, like, I am a servant, thank you. And he's like, not to me, because he doesn't like dudes who seduce their helpless female staff. So he's really trying to pretend that he's not a dude who would seduce his helpless female staff. So she leaves the room, and his automatic response is to climb out of the window and go take a cold swim, even though, may I remind you all, he's still bedridden from illness. Really, this book should have him getting pneumonia and dying, but let's ignore that portion. Another interlude by Lady Whistledown, because I needed these to survive the book. The housemaid wars rage on in London. Lady Penwood called Mrs. Featherington a conniving, ill-bred thief in front of no less than 3 society matrons, including the very popular Dowager Viscountess Bridgerton. Mrs. Featherington responded by calling Lady Penwood's home no better than a workhouse, citing the ill treatment of her lady's maid, whose name, this author has learned, is not Estelle, as was originally claimed, and furthermore, she's not remotely French. The girl's name is Bess, and she hails from Liverpool. Lady Penwood stalked away from the altercation in quite a huff, followed by her daughter, Miss Rosamond Reeling, Lady Penwood's other daughter, Posy, who was wearing an unfortunate green gown, remained behind with a somewhat apologetic look in her eyes, until her mother returned, grabbed her by her sleeve, and dragged her off. This author certainly does not make up the guest lists at society parties, but it is difficult to imagine that the Penwoods will be invited to Mrs. Featherington's next soiree. Okay, so Sophie has this conversation with the caretaker, Mrs. Crabapple, about how she isn't quite a guest, and she isn't quite a servant, and she knows that she'll never be an equal to Benedict because she's been unchaperoned with him, and if she was of his class, like, that would never be allowed. So she decides to make the most of her not being a servant, and decides to go take a walk to the lake. We know it's at the lake, don't we? She finds Benedict bathing, and she decides to watch. And he gets this psychic sense, apparently, that his life is about to change. And according to the book, this has happened twice before. Once right before his father's death, and the second time right before he met the woman at the masquerade. And he realizes that Sophie is spying on him. So he tells her to turn her back and not to go to the house because he can and will chase her while naked. Yeah, so she turns around when he's dressed and he kisses her. She is sad and kind of jealous of herself, and she says that she doesn't do stuff like this. Benedict says he knows and asks who she really is because she speaks too well to be a servant. Sophie says that she wouldn't get far with a low-class accent. Benedict points out she hasn't gotten far at all, which feels like a low blow. And she gets pissed and asks what she should do instead because literally everything he lists she has tried, and, like, it's a wreck and he should really stop because she shouldn't be his responsibility. And Benedict says he could be and invites her to come to London and live with him as his mistress, not a marriage. Important distinction. And she considers becoming his mistress, but remembers how it ended for her mother and the horrible experience for any future children and says, no, thank you. I will not be your mistress. And Benedict, charmer that he is, goes, why would you rather be a housemaid than my mistress? Are you stupid? You don't even have a roof over your head. She's like, okay, I'm gonna go. And he's like, you can't leave. You don't have money or a job. Don't you know how dangerous the world is for women? Yeah, so Benedict is arguing that Sophie is being stupid, so she knocks him on his ass with a punch. If I had a nickel for every time a Bridgerton female lead punched her male love interest, I'd have 2 nickels. Yet he doesn't want her to leave, so his brilliant plan is to grab her ankle and knock her to the ground with him. He admits this isn't gentlemanly, but defends that she threw the first punch. So she goes back to the house as he insists that she come to London with him, and she's like, I won't be your mistress. And he's like, but why? I would take care of our children. And she's like, you will eventually have a wife. And it occurs to him in this moment that she is illegitimate. And so he's like, okay. He's like, at least you can take a souvenir from my home. And she's like, cool, can I take this silver tea set to sell for money? And he goes, sure, you can. And then when she takes it, he says, cool, so you can either come with me and take a job with my mother in London, or I can report you to the magistrate for theft. So, yeah, she agrees to go to London because, the alternative is being hanged, or sent to Australia. So, her jaw dropped a good inch. You're mad, she said. Probably. He shrugged rather casually before settling back in his seat and propping his feet up on the bench across from him. I've all but kidnapped you, after all. I should think that would qualify as the maddest thing I've ever done. You could let me go now, she said, even though she knew he never would. Here in London, where you could be attacked by footpads at any moment? That would be most irresponsible of me, don't you think? It hardly compares to abducting me against my will. I didn't abduct you, he said, idly examining his fingernails. I blackmailed you. There's a world of difference. I don't love Benedict. Violet, hires her in a heartbeat. Benedict starts to speak to Eloise, who bemoans marriage. Violet basically returns to Benedict and is like, hey, what the hell is this girl's deal? And Violet is like, I think I can figure out her identity in a month. And Benedict's like, Eloise might be good for that task. So they very kindly go and interrogate Sophie, and Sophie is sad because they're very kind, but she cannot stay here. Benedict kind of skulks around his mother's home, badgering Sophie. So he's basically pissed that she has chosen to be a maid instead of staying with him where he could give her a better life. And he's really cruel about it. He's like, you chose a life of drudgery over one with me, and then complains a lot. So he kisses her again, and he's like, please come home with me. And she's like, no, you idiot. And he's like, what if I kiss her out in the open where we'd be seen, and then she'd have no choice but to be my mistress? And he doesn't, but, he does really debate it. A week later, Sophie is having tea with the Bridgerton women while she's doing her mending, and Benedict appears, and she starts pricking herself on accident, so she goes outside and realizes that her stepmother moved next door and has been inflicting her abuse on her younger stepsister, Posey. Benedict finds her mid-panic attack and spirits her to his house, even though that's a lot further away than the Bridgerton house, but whatever. She basically says she wishes she had a family like the Bridgertons, and Benedict is like, well, it's not easy. I'm just one of the group. I'm not like an actual individual. And Sophie's like, well, I see your unique quality. You're such a good artist. I've seen your sketches. And he's like, I've never shown them to anyone. And now he's in love. Which, once again, what is with everybody rushing into commitment before being in love with people? Like, you've been trying to blackmail this woman into being your damn mistress for God knows how many pages. They hook up, and he's like, so you'll be my mistress now. And she's like, no, this was a terrible idea. And he complains about how things could be different and XYZ. And Sophie basically avoids the Bridgertons as much as possible for the next 2 weeks. Well, as much as possible when she literally lives and works there. But she's then dragged into tea with everybody, and she mentions offhandedly that Benedict is an artist, and apparently no one in the family knew. Penelope Featherington, who is there, is convinced that she and Sophie have met, and they did see each other at the masquerade briefly. And Sophie flees the scene. Colin, Antony, and Benedict are all outside of their mother's house. Colin complains about Benedict not being bothered about marriage as much as he is, and how his mother keeps suggesting that he marry Penelope Featherington, and how he would never do such a thing. Penelope unfortunately hears this, and Colin feels really bad, and then Antony takes her home. Benedict goes inside and asks his mother what would happen if he married someone outside of their class. I would allow my children to marry paupers if it would bring them happiness. Benedict raised a brow. They would be well-principled and hard-working paupers, of course, Violet explained. No gamblers need apply. Benedict didn't want to laugh at his mother, so instead he coughed discreetly into his handkerchief. And she's basically like, look, I would support you, but you need to consider it carefully because the ton is very judgmental. Sophie is at this point playing blind man's bluff with the children, and Benedict comes to find her or come find Hyacinth, I think, and when he sees Sophie with half her face covered, he realizes she is the masquerade woman. And he yells at his sister and cousins to get the fuck out of the room. Sophie asks him to remove her blindfold, and then he yells and blusters about how she'll be blind for this conversation like he's been for the past month, because he loved her for the past 2 years. He makes her confess who her father is, and then he's just screaming all of this nonsense. Sophie goes to Violet to resign. Violet tells her she knows, but wouldn't ask Sophie to leave, but if she wants, she'll give her money and passage. Sophie is spotted by her stepmother and arrested. So Benedict is fencing with his brother Colin, who tells him he's an idiot and to just marry Sophie and put them all out of their misery. Francesca and Hyacinth see the Whistledown article about Sophie being arrested, and Violet and Benedict go to find her. And then in jail, Sophie hopes God will smite the rats, which I was amused by. So then her stepmom shows up to gloat, and she's like, I'm not trying to have you hanged, Sophie. I'm just having you sent to Australia. So then Benedict arrives with Violet and calls Sophie his fiancée prior to proposing. Posey says that she took the shoe clips to get Sophie out of trouble. Benedict and Sophie take a bath together prior to marriage and then get married off page. After the high that I had on Antony's book, Benedict's book really bummed me out. Not only did I find it kind of weird to have like a fairy tale retelling embedded in the middle of an otherwise entirely like grounded Regency series, Benedict as a person wasn't super engaging. His internal conflict is kind of like, I have no personal identity outside of being a Bridgerton, and to be resolved by this discovery and commitment of his art. But like, I don't remember any moments of the book where Benedict is like thinking about art and how it makes him feel, or like anything. Like, I never feel any kind of passion from him for it. It's more like just this kind of trait that Sophie can notice about him and be like, I see you as a unique person. I like Sophie as a character for the most part. Some of her choices feel very plot motivated, not character motivated. Especially that whole sticking around to watch Benedict bathe thing. Given every other choice she had made in the book, that felt kind of weird. It's a different approach in terms of like structure and plot than we've seen in the previous 2 books, or we'll see for the rest of the series, which I appreciate. The Whistledown recounts of the maid-stealing drama through the book were highly entertaining to me, even though it meant absolutely nothing. I'll never be able to fully escape from the fact that Benedict, like, will go on as a nice, normal man, only to then devolve into blackmailing, kidnapping, and then trying to force Sophie into being his mistress. I also don't really get, like, there's this whole thing about this scandal, and eventually they get the stepmother to, like, publicly proclaims Sophie as the ward of the Earl. So, like, I don't really get what the scandal is, because the scandal eventually means they have to move to the country. Part of me is like, it would be a lot more romantic if Benedict decided to marry her even though she was only a maid, and like, even though he thought the only way to be with her it was as a mistress, he decides screw it and marries her, instead of having this contrived reasoning of why, like, actually marrying her would be fine. I don't know. I didn't love the book. Hello, folks. Now we are on to book 4, which is Colin's book. This is the romance between Penelope Featherington, who has been, tangentially in the previous books, and Colin Bridgerton, who has been also tangentially in the previous books. So the book opens with Penelope talking about how she knew the moment that she fell in love, and I only bring it up because I was highly amused, because she's like, and I know that he felt the exact same way, breathless and taken aback, because that's what happens when you fall off a horse. Because she fell in love with him instantly, and he did not fall in love with her for like 10 plus years. But I liked that introduction. At like age 16, Penelope is walking and she has her bonnet swept off her head, and it smacks Colin in the face and knocks him off the horse, and she's in love with him. We go back to that whole, like, Colin doesn't want to marry Penelope thing from Benedict's book, you recall. And then we skip several seasons, and she is now 28 years old and a spinster. In a lot of the critiques of this book, you'll find a lot of things about how Penelope loses a significant amount of weight after her first season, and it's less prominent than I expected, but still kind of weird. Anyway, I thought I'd acknowledge it. The weirdest part to me is that she loses that weight after her first season, but then spends the subsequent 9 seasons still a sad spinster, which seems very counter to this book's, or the world's, estimation of things. I don't know, it confused me. Colin and Antony talk about Colin finding a wife, being happy, and Colin is just thinking about how he desperately wants, like, a life's work and a legacy. He's thinking about Antony and how he has being the Viscount, and he's thinking about Benedict and how Benedict is a painter, and he's thinking about himself and how he's basically nothing. At Violet's birthday party, which is a big deal, Colin dances with Penelope and thinks, well, she's not pretty, but she's not pretty, and it's a shame that no one's really thought about her personality in the past 10 years, because she'd make a good wife. So then Lady Danbury comes over to talk to Colin, and Colin offers Penelope £20 to not leave him alone with Lady Danbury. And Lady Danbury says to him how much she likes Penelope. Then a group of people kind of assemble themselves around Lady Danbury and go, God, we're so bored. Nothing's happening this season. The only good thing is reading Whistledown. There's also kind of a bit where, like, several people in the conversation don't realize Penelope is there. Like, she'll say something and they'll be like, oh, Penelope, I didn't realize you were here. Anyway, Lady Danbury announces that she's going to give £1,000 to whoever unmasks Lady Whistledown. So this is obviously going to be our setting. Now, if you, like me, watched the show or have already read the books, you know who Lady Whistledown is. I'm just going to keep that vague at this point, because if you're reading the books in order, you don't technically know who it is yet. Sometime later, Penelope is walking by herself to the Bridgertons for tea, kind of dancing as she goes, and she sees Colin, who suggests they dance together in the street. And she's like, no, people would think that we were courting, and you broke up with me, and that would suck, even though I'm a spinster. And Colin is like, where is your maid? Where is your chaperone? You are unchaperoned on the streets of London. And Penelope is like, man, I'm a 28-year-old spinster. What? The rules are quite different. So they kind of argue about that until he agrees. The assorted Bridgertons who are there and Penelope all discuss the matter of discovering Whistledown. Hyacinth in particular is very interested, but her mother keeps reminding her that her primary objective should be finding a husband. Penelope comes over a different time to see Eloise and ends up finding Colin's journal from his travels. Also, I didn't really mention, but Colin travels. He's just returned from Cyprus. It's kind of his thing. He's like, I have nothing, but he travels a lot. It's kind of his shtick. So she reads this page from his journal, and he's upset because people don't tend to like when, well, I guess they're not strangers, but other people read their private writings. So then he accidentally slices his hand on a letter opener somehow, and Penelope helps stem the bleeding and hide it from the butler. I don't know why it has to be hidden from the butler. So she's like, your writing is actually really good. And he's like, wow, really? And he's like fawning for compliments. And they have this conversation where he's like, boy, I hate my life. And he doesn't try and seek meaning, he's just kind of petulant about it. You'll recall from the last book there was a brief mention of people called the Smiths. They are only mentioned in the books as a family of people where the debutantes put on a hideous musical performance every year. And so Penelope attends this performance. And Penelope insists on sitting up at the front so that the performers don't have to look at mean-spirited faces. And Lady Danbury sees her there and goes on about how Whistledown seems like she's actually soft-hearted and that she could be Penelope. Colin runs into Penelope. He apologizes. Penelope's like, hey, you should publish your writing. And Colin says, nah. So then, like, a day later, Colin comes to Penelope's home just in a complete and utter snit because he believes that Eloise is Whistledown and it will cast her from society because of how many people she's insulted over the last decade. Once again, we haven't really seen any of... Like, the only insult that I've actually really seen was the calling of Kate a singed daffodil. And Kate continues to like Lady Whistledown. I mean, okay, fine. Lady Whistledown also calls Penelope Featherington a overripe citrus fruit. Like, that is the most scathing that we really get. Yeah, he's basically like, well, Eloise is, like, always writing things and has ink on her hands. She must be Lady Whistledown. We get this section of Penelope's internal monologue that if you were to read it a first time with no context is fine, but if you were to read it with context or a second time, becomes confusing because she's like, Eloise couldn't be Whistledown. I would stake my life on it. And this isn't what she's saying to Colin. This is her internal thoughts. And we'll get back to that. Because they're unchaperoned in a drawing room. Seriously, where are the fucking chaperones? I'm going to lose it. Penelope's like, well, I'm a 28-year-old spinster, and I'm gonna die with never having been kissed. Will you kiss me, Colin? And Colin is like, you know, now that you think of it, I actually really would want to kiss Penelope Featherington. So he does. And then he's horrified that Penelope thinks that he kissed her out of pity, so he flees the scene as if that's going to make her think any differently. So anyway, he goes to his mother's, gets soaked in the rain, and accuses Eloise of being Lady Whistledown, which she denies, and she's like, I'm writing letters. And she's kind of weird and cagey about these letters. So then, Lady Whistledown announces her retirement, and the town is distraught. A woman literally faints dead away in the street at the news. About a week later, Penelope is chaperoning her sister at a ball. Lady Danbury approaches and is like, hey, I'm really fond of you. I would like to see you settled in a marriage before you die. And then Colin shows up. Cressida Cowper grabs the attention of everyone and announces that she was Lady Whistledown. Colin goes to Penelope's because he didn't have the chance to apologize at the ball, and then sees her getting into a hired cab by herself. And he's like, huh, that's weird. I mean, the rules for spinsters are different, but, like, that's still really weird. So he has his driver follow her as she drives deep into London, and he gets out and follows her to a church and gets exceedingly pissed off and demands to know why she's here and what she's doing. Which one might think, you don't really have the right to that information, but whatever. She's like, no, and he takes an envelope from her hands, and it reveals a new copy of Lady Whistledown. So he gets back in the cab, and he's very upset with her for a whole flurry of reasons, most of which revolve around lying. It's a little unclear. And he's like, why don't you just let Cressida Cowper take the, well, she's not Cowper anymore. She's married, she's widowed. It might be Tremblay. She might be Cressida Tremblay. I don't remember. The bottom line is that Cressida has basically given Penelope an out, someone to take the fall for Lady Whistledown. And Colin is like, you should take that. People are going to be pissed. They need someone to be pissed at. Let them be pissed at her because, I don't want you getting hurt. And so they vehemently argue in this cab. And then Colin kisses her and they make out in the carriage. So then the cab is going back to the Featherington home where Colin told it to go. And Penelope is like, oh my god, I have to make myself presentable. And Colin decides to come and escort her inside. And she's like, what the hell? What are you doing? People will see us. And he's like, for God's sake, Penelope, will you marry me or not? Which comes out a lot more sudden in the book than it did in the show, and it was sudden in the show. Yeah, it's a very extreme escalation. Penelope literally falls out of the she trips and falls. Okay? So then Colin just wanders inside the Featherington home and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to ask for Penelope's hand. It'll be swell." So he stumbles into a full Featherington family gathering, which includes Penelope's 3 sisters. We haven't really addressed this yet, but the Featheringtons have a 4th daughter in these books. Her name is Felicity, and she's Hyacinth's best friend. She is not really relevant at any point, except for the following point. He kind of walks into this full-on Featherington family gathering. It's got both of her older sisters, her younger sister, her sister's husbands, and her mother. So he's trying to get Portia, Mrs. Featherington, to listen to him. "I think I shall go out into the garden," Prudence suddenly announced, taking hold of her husband's arm. "Penelope, why don't you come with me?" Penelope opened her mouth a few seconds before she figured out what to say, leaving her looking a bit like a confused fish. But in Colin's opinion, a rather fishing fish, if such a thing were possible. Finally, her chin took on a resolute mien, and she said, "I don't think so, Prudence." "Penelope!" Mrs. Featherington exclaimed. "I need you to show me something," Prudence ground out. "I really think I'm needed here," Penelope replied. "I can join you this afternoon, if you like. I need you now." Okay, so Colin walks into a room with Penelope, okay? All of the other sisters are sent out of the room, and Colin and Penelope insist on Penelope's presence during the conversation, okay? And Colin says, "Mrs. Featherington, I would like permission to marry your daughter." And Portia, for some reason, believes that he is asking for permission to marry Felicity. And Colin is losing his damn mind. So, basically, Penelope here is trying to keep the peace. "But Felicity is unmarried, and so are you," he pointed out. "I know, but I'm old, and Felicity is an infant," he spat. "Good God, marrying her would be like marrying Hyacinth." Except for the incest," Penelope said. He gave her an extremely unamused look. "Right," she said, mostly trying to fill the silence. "It's just a terrible misunderstanding, isn't it?" No one said anything. Penelope looked at Colin pleadingly. "Isn't it? It certainly is," he muttered. She turned to her mother. "Mama?" "Penelope," she murmured, and Penelope knew that her mother wasn't asking her a question, rather she was still expressing her disbelief that Colin would want to marry her. "And oh, but it hurts so much. You'd think she'd be used to it by now." "I would like to marry Mr. Bridgerton," Penelope said, trying to summon up as much quiet dignity as she could manage. "He asked me, and I said yes." "Well, of course you would say yes," her mother retorted. "You'd have to be an idiot to say no." "Mrs. Featherington," Colin said tightly, "I would suggest you begin treating my future wife with a bit more respect." "Colin, it's not necessary," Penelope said, placing her hand on his arm. But the truth was, her heart was soaring. He might not love her, but he cared for her. No man could defend a woman with such fierce protectiveness without caring for her. He has this whole section in his internal monologue where he's like, "Yeah, I don't love Penelope," which, will one of these people be in love? Please? I guess Benedict was, but he did it through, blackmail. Then, Eloise and Penelope have like a discussion where Eloise is like super cagey about her correspondence, and Eloise admits her feelings on Penelope getting married are super mixed. So then Colin shows up again and they make out again, and he gets all in his head being like, do I love her? What if I love her? And he goes to Daphne and he's like, how do you know you're in love? And Daphne's like, I don't know, dude. And Colin's just like, I know our marriage will be great, but like I don't know if I love her. Okay? So then they go to their engagement ball. Lady Danbury issues her congratulations. And then a Whistledown announcement comes that she is not Cressida, and Colin is absolutely pissed because he took their argument in the carriage to mean that she was going to give up being Lady Whistledown. She never explicitly says that, but he just kind of assumed that. So he takes Penelope upstairs, rages at her, decides he loves her, and then they have sex and confess their love to one another. And then Colin's like, damn, I'm really jealous that, like, my future wife has a life's work and I don't. And Colin's like, I really want to get married to Penelope now. So he lies to their mothers about the fact that they had sex. Not saying that they didn't, just saying they had it weeks before they did. And so Penelope is like, hey, my lovely fiance, you get really cagey and shut down whenever we talk about a Lady Whistledown. I feel like you're ashamed of me. And he just kind of shuts down and doesn't clarify anything. So she's like, oh, he loves me, but he's ashamed of this massive part of me. Damn. So then they get married. Penelope stops trying to discuss Whistledown with him, and she's like, hey, can we go on a honeymoon trip? And he's like, later, because I want to be in Whistledown. I want to be in London when Whistledown's thing finally breaks out. Okay. So then Colin's like, yeah, you can finally read some more of my journals. And she does, and they have this really long talk about how great their lives are and how jealous Colin was of her. And then we reveal this backstory about how Penelope's father's lawyer stumbled across some papers that Penelope had written that were essentially an early draft of Whistledown when she was in her first season and was just miserable in society. And then it accidentally became a massive success. So they've ironed out all of their issues, and they're happy. There were, however, many pages left to go, so I was like, okay. So then Cressida stops by just to blackmail her. She basically figures out that Penelope is Lady Whistledown because Penelope insulted Cressida in a way, and then Lady Whistledown used the same insult, so she was like, I never forget an insult. So fair. Colin and Penelope have this discussion where Penelope's like, hey, I think Lady Danbury would, like, take the hit on this for me, and she can take the credit, and, like, she's respected enough that it's not gonna ruin her. And Colin rejects this and leaves, and he's like, I'm gonna fix everything. Yeah, he sends notes to various members of the Bridgerton family to stick to Penelope like glue, and this is emphasized several times, as is the fact that Eloise disappears. Penelope and Eloise. Very well, it's not as if I could stop them anyway, but do tell. What did Colin mean when he instructed us to stick to you like glue? I'm sure I don't know. Violet's eyes narrowed as if assessing Penelope's honestly. He was quite emphatic. He underlined the word glue, you know. I know, Penelope replied just as Eloise said. I told her. He underlined it twice, Hyacinth added. If his ink had been any darker, I'm sure I would have had to go out and slaughter a horse myself. Hyacinth! Violet exclaimed. Hyacinth just shrugged. It's all very intriguing. I really can't express how much the glue thing comes up. Did he send you a note as well? Eloise asked. Daphne nodded. Yes, we're to keep an eye on her, he said. Could be worse, Hyacinth said. We're to stick to her like glue, she leaned forward. He underlined glue. And here I thought I wasn't a chore, Penelope quipped. Oh, you're not, Hyacinth said breezily. But there's something rather enjoyable about the word glue. Slides off the tongue rather pleasingly, don't you think? Glue. Glue. Is it me, Eloise asked, or has she gone mad in the head? Yeah, so then Colin makes a plan which he orchestrated without Penelope's knowledge or consent, and announces that she's Whistledown to the entire town, who applaud. Which is contrary to everything that we're supposedly meant to believe about this problem, but okay. Yeah, so then there's an epilogue where Colin has published his journals, and Penelope has stopped writing Lady Whistledown, and is considering writing a novel about a wallflower. And then there's the second epilogue. Yeah, this is the one I find least charming. It's basically going into how when Eloise disappeared from that ball, she went to go meet Sir Philip Crane. We're going to get into Sir Philip Crane in just a minute here. But it's basically that Eloise ran off and then is being forced into marriage, and then Penelope and Colin debate telling her she's Whistledown, only to try and tell her in the end, and Hyacinth has already told her. It's weird. It's a weird choice because it doesn't really center Penelope and Colin's relationship in the way that the other excerpts do, and I feel like we could have had this scene in the 5th book. Well, that would include mentioning Lady Whistledown after this book, which does not happen. So I will say that, like, this is really where we see Eloise's wedding. We don't really see it in her book. And it has this really nice moment between Eloise and Penelope, and it's kind of the first time that I feel like we have a really nice moment between Eloise and Penelope. So I'm going to read that section to you, because I think it is probably the best section of the epilogue and potentially the book. Who would have thought that we'd both marry within months of each other, Penelope mused. Weren't we meant to be old crones together? We can still be old crones, Eloise replied gaily. We shall simply be married old crones. It'll be grand, magnificent, stupendous. We shall be leaders of crone fashion, arbiters of cronish taste. What, Hyacinth demanded, hands on hips, are the two of you talking about? Eloise lifted her chin and looked down her nose at her. You're far too young to understand. And she and Penelope practically collapsed in a fit of giggles. They've gone mad, Mother, Hyacinth announced. Like, the thing that drives me nuts is, like, there are certain interactions, and it's usually the non-romantic interactions, like the friendly interactions, or the, like, familial interactions, that I really love in these books. They're just buried in a lot of things I don't especially like. So, this is the Lady Whistledown book. It kind of has the two separate, connected but kind of disjointed parts. There's, like, the Penelope and Colin love story, and then there's the Lady Whistledown drama, and, like, they overlap, but not in any of, like, the ways that one would think they might. The 10-year time gap, I think it makes sense in a way. I understand needing the 10-year time gap to get to Eloise, because of her whole kind of take on marriage, and the 10-year time gap is needed to age up Hyacinth and Gregory. Francesca, we'll get to. Her whole thing is kind of that she's on her second marriage, so it's a little bit of a different situation. The 10-year time gap for Penelope and Colin felt unnecessary, but whatever. While Penelope's been in love with Colin for ages, I just want to make clear to anyone that advertised this to me as a friends to lovers romance, it's not. The show version is, because they, like, are friends. These two people are not friends. She's his sister's best friend, who he, like, knows vaguely and thinks about not at all. Like, he doesn't regard her particularly highly. Like, it's like a sudden realization to him in this book that, like, she has a personality that's, like, intriguing. So, like, it's just not a friends to lovers. I will protest. Compared to the other books, whose relationships escalate very quickly, this was very fast. Like, this was real breakneck. We start with the Whistledown stuff, and then Colin's fears about it with Eloise, and then they kiss, and then here's the other thing. Lady Danbury is like, oh, I want to matchmake for you, and I was like, oh, that's gonna be the thing, right? Like, Lady Danbury is gonna try and set up Penelope with a husband because Lady Danbury respects her and wants her to be happy, and then Colin's gonna be like, oh, damn, like, I actually do like her. I thought that was gonna be of some... No, we, like, introduce that thread and kill it immediately. Because that same evening, she and Colin get engaged. Because he follows her, finds out she's Whistledown, goes and gets engaged. Or maybe it's the next day. Like, it's within 24 hours. Okay? It escalated so quick. I don't know. I don't care. Like, there's so much going on. The only real conflict is that Colin is upset that Penelope is still doing something dangerous, though there's never any proof that it has any negative repercussions. Like, Cressida Cowper, not Cowper, I keep forgetting that she has a different last name that I didn't write down. Cressida never faces any backlash, she never faces any violence, any threats, anything that would make us believe, oh, this is going to be a dangerous avenue for Penelope to be open about. Nothing. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Penelope is Lady Whistledown. He announces it, and everyone claps, and then for 4 books, we don't talk about it. It doesn't come up. And, like, the book isn't bad, I guess. And actually, Colin is probably the least objectionable of the men. Probably even more so than Antony. But his love story is so fast-paced and buried in a bunch of, like, other extraneous stuff that I don't actually care about him. Like, I do, but I don't. I don't know. I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, I just do not.